Hi, I'm Justin.
Also, I hate the way my voice sounds, so if you can, do whatever Photoshop does to voices, make me sound awesome.
And this is my lovely friend,
The beauty in the eyes of the beholder, and it's just about getting into the seat of being the beholder.
Hayley.
I don't think you have to be particularly perceptive. I just think you have to look up.
This podcast is mostly just her telling me stories.
If you expose yourself to the possibility that this might be really awkward, there can be something just really cool on the other side of it.
She thinks that her life and way of looking at things are
Oh, I was kind of waiting on you. I thought you were getting your stuff ready. You're waiting on me?
pretty normal.
You got to edit out all the misinformation about the Amish.
Maybe you can relate.
I would like a chance to re-sing the Amish Paradise.
If you want lighthearted stories
All right, you want to talk about goats?
and stream of consciousness,
I just woke up and needed some friends, and so I bought them.
then you're going to like the Sunny Side Up podcast.
Sunny side up, sunny side up, sunny side up, sunny side up.
So, if you're at all like me, you may feel that you're living in a world that can be a bit overwhelming and confusing at times. I'm also a huge fan of podcasts, documentaries, docudramas, stories, and of just information in general. Between all of that and the social media and news, sometimes our brains can feel like they're on overload. Hayley and I hope that this podcast can be something of an antidote to all of that. Like little jello shots of joy and distraction. None of it is too serious or really too informative. Mostly it's just two friends who have conversational chemistry talking about whatever enters the minds of relatively ADHD people. We hope you enjoy.
Okay, so my dad was not present when we were growing up. He was around. He lived in the same town. He lived within eyesight of my school, but
Okay.
I never saw him.
Were your mom and dad ever together?
Yeah, they divorced when I was 3 or 4.
Okay.
And so we lived in the same county, but he just was not involved
Not in your life, yeah.
and wasn't present. And so I've got, in hindsight, some, real tearjerker childhood memories of kind of imagining who he was or whatever. But I grew up hearing the snippets of what he was doing and what he was about. And drugs were a big part of his life, and alcohol. And I finally got curious enough whenever I got a driver's license that I would go. I just went and kind of got to know him. And the story seemed mostly true.
Okay.
There were some drugs on the coffee table,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So I had grown up hearing about him and some investigative work that he was doing. He thought he was a private investigator, and everybody else thought he was crazy. And drugs will do that, so just be careful with your recreational hobbies, kids. But
Right.
whenever I went to him and kind of got to know him, I was like, oh, yeah, for sure, off the deep end. Ouch. Let's hope that genetics
Right. Yeah.
pan out a little bit differently. A few years roll by, and he sobers up somewhat. Okay? And I had him in the car one day because he needed a ride, and since he couldn't jump out on the interstate because he was a super big dude, by the way. Another one of those.
Like big dude, overweight, or we're talking about just large and overweight, big framed?
Actually, both.
Okay.
Yeah. I think my great-grandfather or my grandfather on that side was 6'7".
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And that back in the day, that's 20 feet tall.
Even now in the day. And for a girl, that's some genetics.
Yeah.
I may feel a little large from time to time, but
No.
there's, genetically speaking, I'm doing all right.
Yeah.
I can fold myself into a regular-sized vehicle. But anyhow.
Yeah.
So he couldn't escape the vehicle, and I had a moment to kind of ask him some of those questions, where have you been all my life? But we kind of unpacked it.
Was there music playing when you said that? Where have you been all my life?
Oh my gosh, I hope so. Did I have a soundtrack for that?
I feel like you missed something if you didn't.
Any kid with an absentee parent who finally gets the chance to ask their parent, what were you doing with all the time that you weren't with me, has definitely got a soundtrack for that moment. But it's probably...
Did you ever consider that it could have been you?
All the time.
Yeah.
Of course.
I mean...
Because occasionally he did send gifts to my sister, and I never got one.
You never... So, oh my God. So, it's process of elimination. You're like, oh
my
my
mom
God.
had 6 kids, so there was room to pick favorites.
Right. Okay.
I've asked her before she had favorites, and she just said...
All from the same guy?
Oh, no. The first 4 were from the dad who wasn't present.
Okay.
For my life. He did stick around for the others, so maybe you're onto something. I was
Poor
the
Hayley.
youngest of the
Oh.
4. Look at me.
Look at you.
That was not the answer he gave, though, because I just did
Okay,
ask. I was
yeah.
like, what were you doing with all that time?
Yeah.
And he starts telling me about his investigations.
Okay.
And he's sober enough that he's telling the story. Like, if he was still, if he was still tweaking on something, I'm less likely to absorb all the details. But in this case, no, he was coherent and he was clear-headed. And he said just enough things that I had some suspicions that it might have been true.
Wait,
I'm not buying it.
Are you about to drop to me that he was part of getting rid of the President Kennedy assassination? No. Okay. All right. I was like, what, is this a bombshell? Like, are we about to okay.
Like, how many details do you want about this?
all of them.
Like, I guess, oh man, I don't want anybody to force me to jump off the building later. Like, I don't want to have to jump off a roof later.
You don't want to?
If I'm telling any of these conspiracy stories. But no,
okay.
like he would tell me stories about corrupt local law enforcement murders that were actually conducted by sheriff's departments, that sort of thing. That's what he devoted his time to investigating. And
he was a vigilante.
Well, in his mind. But again, everybody else had always just discredited him and said it was drugs and stuff. But the more he talked, the more details he gave, that let me know that this is rooted in truth somewhere.
Rooted in truth, yeah.
So I was like, if you were an investigator, you didn't have any money, like you didn't have a job. That's a hobby at best. And he was like, no, they paid me. And I was like, well, how did they pay you? And he's like, my disability check. I was like, you've got a disability. And he's like, no, I don't. But he got a disability check. And he's like, that was how they disguised my payment because I was an undercover agent. And I was like, oh, that is undercover.
That is very undercover. And who is the they?
Okay, right? So
we never know who they are.
He started off doing these investigations on local murders.
Okay. That were being potentially done by the sheriff, which I'm already in.
And he drops his paperwork off to the state justice department and everything else. And he said one day he gets a call, and my mother had to drive him to Jackson and drop him off. That's the Mississippi State Capitol, right? And he has to go into this building. And he described the state Capitol building and walking up to an office on the second floor or whatever floor it was. But he knew enough about the inside of the state Capitol building that he must have been there.
Right.
And he says they offered him the position of being agent number 1 for the Office of Investigator General.
001?
And I'm like, Dad, I'm working on a master's degree in political science, and I just took a course on Mississippi politics, and we don't even have an Office of Investigator General. And he said, we don't, because at the end of that year, the legislature voted not to fund it. And so it just didn't happen. But at the time that they offered it to me and gave me an assignment, it was still going to happen. Wow. Okay, so that's just enough.
Right.
Like if you are crazy and you're just doing drugs,
that stuff.
Right?
Dude, so your dad, he didn't abandon you. He was out fighting.
Oh, no, he totally abandoned me. This was something that he picked up along the way.
I'm trying to salvage this. Okay.
No, there's no salvaging that circumstance. But it's cool. I mean,
Yeah, you turned out fine.
Oh, I have a good mom.
Yeah.
But he so he's telling the story, and he describes some of his investigative research. And at that point, he had been called in, and they wanted him to look into some prison murders.
Dang.
And he gets involved, and he does the research, and he has some information. And then he's name-dropping these people throughout the car ride. And again, I'm still kind of like, I don't really know what to believe about this guy, so I'm only paying half attention. And a few years passed. We'll fast forward, and after he had passed away, so the drug episodes were real. Okay, so I would get voicemails from him sometimes, and they would just be like rants, and I would get these emails that would just delete, store, whatever, and it would just be crazy stuff. So years later, after he passed away, I was just kind of thinking through that car ride, and some of those names still stuck in my head, and I decided to check those emails, and these are the same names. Like it's the same story, so it's a real story to him.
Yep.
And then I Google them, and that's a real person.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So
Dang.
Ramsey Clark was actually an attorney general for the United States under Kennedy or Johnson. I'm not sure around that time. he was an amazing human being. Helped write the Civil Rights Acts. I believe he even marched in Montgomery during some of the marches.
Wow.
Like, he was on the team that represented Saddam Hussein during some human rights trials. Like, he's
Very committed to
human
civil
rights.
Yeah.
Human rights and civil rights. Like the OG, as far as I'm concerned, a fascinating legal career in the United States. I think his father was also a Supreme Court justice, so the whole family's got it, right?
Yeah.
So that's who my dad said he was working on whenever he was investigating some of these prison murders. And I Google it, and sure enough, Ramsey Clark did, in fact, look into prison murders in the 90s in Mississippi. And there was another guy that my dad mentioned, and he was working on putting a documentary together because his brother was one of the ones who was killed during the actual civil rights era in Mississippi. He'd come down like Freedom Summer doing some work and was murdered by some of the racist white supremacist Klan, whichever powers that be, during that summer.
Wow.
So his brother was interested in doing some documentaries, and he had exchanged communication with my dad. So I'm like,
wait, did you independently verify that he had communications with your dad?
Well, so once my dad I checked those emails, and in one of those emails, he's like, hey, they're asking me about giving them some of my information so they could do this documentary, and I need your input on this because I was a fledgling attorney, and he thought I knew something, which, spoiler alert, baby lawyers don't know anything, right? They just turn us out of law school and say, go learn something now.
Right.
But I had the names in that email, so then I contacted my uncle, and I'm like, okay, all this time I thought my dad was crazy, but now I'm beginning, maybe I am crazy because I'm believing some of it. And my uncle's like, no, that was real. I talked to those people. They were absolutely involved with him.
Wow.
Yes, that work was real. So I don't know that the documentary was ever produced. I don't know that anything came of it, but what I've kind of put together in my mind, what might have happened was something was happening, and the state of Mississippi wanted to know what sort of details are accessible to someone who's looking. So they hired my dad to find the stuff to see what information is out there. So then when my dad gives them the information and they can see, this is our exposure.
Yep.
These are the loose ends we need to tie up.
This is like the banks that hire the people to rob them.
So they see where their weaknesses are? Okay, yeah. Like hack our system so we'll know.
System.
All right, I think that's what my dad was doing. So I don't know how they found him. I don't know who hired him. I don't know who was in that office. But I do believe that the work that he was doing was real.
Wow.
I believe that, well, at least real enough to him. Like, it was still shady.
Yeah.
But I think that
I kind of like this. This is
right.
I feel like there's a movie
do you see
here.
what I'm saying? Like, why would my super overweight, knocked out on the couch all of the time dad know who Ramsey Clark was or who Ben Chaney was enough to use their names and ask me these questions and the nuances of the Mississippi political structure?
My only pushback on that would have been, like, let's say he was like a voracious reader and like
he was not. He was a passed out drunk all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, that's good. So in this movie, I now have a movie with like this deadbeat dad with a lot of kids who is always like kind of whining and crying in his bottle, and he's very brooding and unhappy. And there's like this kind of like sad relationship with his youngest daughter, this sweet girl. We can't quite figure out why. You know, he's just not better to. Her name's Hayley. And I'm trying to understand.
It's Norse for heroine, by the way.
Norse?
Like, as in it's Norse for like female hero. That's what that name means. I just wanted you to know that.
Hayley means female hero?
I mean, it depends on what baby name book you pick up, but in one of them, that's what it meant.
Because when you said heroine, I did not think
drugs.
of. Yeah, I just went right to drugs.
That would be a lot more fun.
Right. It's like a female drug.
That's why I said female
I'm just like,
hero.
so who plays your dad in this movie? Because in the end, we find out that he is working for the government. He's like deep state, deep cover, at least.
But not like the real government, but like the secret government. The government that we all suspect is out there watching
I'm saying,
us.
deep state. Were you listening?
This guy put tinfoil in his apartment windows before we knew what the NSA was about.
Wow.
So, like, there was
he
some
wearing
crazy.
soup? What was it, a soup pot on his head?
For tornado protection? No, he was usually passed out kind of naked. Like the time that I finally drove to his apartment.
Not scarring.
Or drove to his apartment and be like, hi, you haven't seen me since I was like in kindergarten, but I would like to say hello to you. He was not wearing clothes. He had to get up and get dressed. And it was like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So.
Wow. Yeah. He's a relaxed lifestyle in some ways.
Bohemian.
Bohemian.
Yeah. But it was kind of cool. I did my best when I found out about that to reach out to Ramsey Clark, just write a letter and say, don't know if any of your research in the 90s actually came to fruition, but my dad had mentioned it. I thought he was crazy. Now I realize possibly he wasn't. I don't know what kind of response I thought I would get, but I ended up getting no responses. And then Ramsey Clark passed away last year, so my dream of just meeting him and maybe someday just having a coffee or something passed. But there's a Reddit thread out there somewhere where Ramsey Clark is in there through his daughter's account or granddaughter's account, like answering questions and talking about his career.
Wow.
If you just need to deep dive into somebody's biography, he is the guy. In the meantime, somebody recently has put out a documentary about him, and there's probably plenty of information on the internet. He's written several books, but fascinating legal career. Apparently my dad's was kind of fascinating too, but in a very different way. Much shorter documentary, but
still interesting.
That was the time that I discovered that a person who I just thought was a crazy conspiracy theorist turned out to maybe have an element of reality to it, which is probably true for most conspiracy theorists. There's an element of truth to a lot of what's being said there.
Hello, lovely friends. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. And it would mean the world if you would tell other people about this podcast and maybe even spam your social media accounts with just how much you're enjoying it. If you are, of course. Also, commenting and rating us on whatever platform you're downloading or streaming from is incredibly helpful to a little startup podcast like this one. On the other hand, if you are dissatisfied with your listening experience, please leave all of that hate on someone else's podcast. Just maybe to confuse them a little bit, right? But most of all, we hope you keep looking up and looking for the sunny side of life.